Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. One of my recent videos talked about how to build your own rock sliders, and more specifically about how to bend tubing in a super affordable way. If you didn't check that video out, you're gonna wanna go do it. The link is down in the description. It's a good intro to building things out of tube, but that left one big question unanswered, and that was how to notch tubing in a cheap, easy way. So today we're going to talk about it. Now, every piece of tube that you cut that gets attached to another piece of tube has to be notched or angle cut in order to make it fit correctly. So when it comes to taking tube and notching it, clearly it doesn't sit on there too nicely, and we're going to want to adjust it so that it does. The typical rule of thumb is that you're going to notch your tube 1/3 the diameter of the tube. So for my 1 3/4 tube, I notched the throat depth, which I'll talk about in just a second, at about 1/2 inch. Without getting too far into it, all you're going to need to notch your tube, according to the way I do it in this video, is a grinder, a flap wheel, a cutoff wheel, a Sharpie, and a tape measure. That's it. You don't need any fancy tube notchers. Guys, I'm not gonna waste any more of your time. Let me show you the basic tube notch. So here's a piece of tube. Like I said before, you gotta know your diameter. This happens to be 1 3/4. The first thing you're gonna wanna do, once you know which end of the tube that you are going to be notching, is mark the ends of the tube. So in this case, I'm just going to use a regular Sharpie. I'm going to mark the end of the tube right on the face at 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the closer you get it to perfect, the better it's going to be. Now, I'm going to take those lines and just basically extend them down the sides of the tube just a tiny bit to make sure that I can see them when I'm looking at the side of the tube. Now, it's also important when you go to notch a tube that you get your measurement correctly, because you are removing a certain amount of material off the tube. So, for example, we know that we're going to notch the throat depth of this 1/2 inch deeper from the end of the tube. So you want to make sure that you have at least an extra 1/2 inch of length from where the throat is going to contact the tube. And again, I'll show you guys that in just a couple of minutes. So now I'm just going to use a basic tape measure. I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch from the end of the tube, and I'm going to make a little mark. I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to do that again. And I'm basically going to do that all the way around my tube so that I can connect the dots and draw a line that's 1/2 inch in from the end of the tube. But what you essentially did with that 1/2 inch line is essentially made the depth that you're going to cut the throat to, where we make the shape for the tube notch. So what we're going to do is basically go from that little mark, let's call it 6 o'clock, that we made and kind of brought it down the side. I'm going to basically make it now on my throat line, and then I'm going to go to the opposite side of that to make another mark on the throat line, right? So these are going to be my deep cuts, and these ends where we have the other marks at the 3 and 9 o'clock position are going to be where the tube is still long. And at this point, we're basically just going to go from the long part of the tube, from that mark, and draw the straightest line that you can, which is hard to do on round tubing, down to the spot you made on the throat mark. Right, so you can see it there. We're starting to draw where we're going to cut, and then we're going to go from that throat mark back out to the long side of the tube on the opposite end. All right, so now you guys can see that we have the throat mark. We have it marked out where we're going to cut, and now it's time to hit it with a grinder. So I'm going to use my cutoff wheel. I'm going to start at the end of the tube, and I'm basically just going to cut along that line to the throat. Then I'll rotate it, do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll go back and we'll cut the other way, basically just eliminating these chunks out of the tube. Here we are. with the end of the tube kind of cut out and notched. It's already starting to look like something. Now is when I take the flap wheel and I just clean it up. The flap wheel usually will have a very squared off edge, but as they get old, that edge kind of starts to round itself out a little bit. I like to keep a couple of old wheels that kind of work, but they don't work so well in my toolbox. That way, when it comes time for me to notch some tube, I have the right wheel with the right shape on it to actually notch it out. Now, you can do it with the squared off wheel, but a fresh wheel removes a lot of material very, very quickly. So using one of the old worn out ones is usually a little bit better, a little bit more efficient in this situation. What you're typically gonna wanna do is take that wheel that's a little bit rounded out, put it in the depth of your throat, and just kind of smooth it and drag it out to the outside edge of the piece of tubing. You'll flip it over, you'll do the same thing on the other side. That gives it a little bit of a bevel, as well as cleans it out in here to make it fit for a round piece of tube to just fit in there nicely. You saw how it fit before, look how it fits now, right? So the tube comes down around the edges nicely. It sits nicely there. It's nice and tight. It's almost perfect. And as we come around the other side, you can see that the other side basically fits perfect. And once again, guys, I mean, that right there is the right depth, because again, it's about 1/3 of the diameter. Nothing more than a grinder, right? This video was not long, and it had a lot of me talking and moving the camera around to show you how to do this. Like I said, the only really super important thing to remember with this is that this depth right here, your throat, that is the thing that you need to be careful about when you're measuring. Because guys, there is nothing worse than measuring out, bending a piece of tube, and then cutting it and having it be too short once it's notched. Now, obviously, this is just a perfect 90-degree, you know, mate to a tube. But it gives you the baseline for you to do things like this on a little bit of an angle. Because if I'm putting this tube on here and then I want to match that angle, clearly one side's throat has to be different than the other side. But like I said, once you guys understand how to mark the tube, you can basically figure out that measurement, start hacking away at it a little bit, and the more you do it, the better you're gonna get. But thinking that you need to spend a minimum of $300 or maybe more on a tube notcher to be able to do something like this, you definitely don't. Use the tools you already got, spend a few minutes, cut it out, hit it with a grinder, and away you go. Guys, stay tuned. There's gonna be a ton more videos coming. I'm about to start putting some color on this thing, figure out the steering, brake lines, fuel lines, all that kind of stuff, and start up this LS swapped buggy pretty soon. So stay tuned. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, share it with your friends, and get out there. Make sure you build something.